With more and more vulnerabilities found all the time, it's time to lock down your NAS devices and protect your data and your network. Today we're going to cover all the things you should consider when attempting to secure your QNAP device. If you haven't already done so, please hit that subscribe button and click the notifications so you'll be notified of any new content. So if you follow security news at all, you may have heard that recently they found two more vulnerabilities inside of QNAP units. The first was found in the web server and the second was found in the DLNA server, both using the default port configuration. But this video today is not really about these two particular vulnerabilities. It's more about how to configure your device for best practices. Vulnerabilities and issues will come up on a constant basis regardless of whether you're running a QNAP, a Synology, a Windows server, whatever it is. You're always going to have some threats or vulnerabilities. So the intent today is to establish, at least from a QNAP perspective, the best practices and what items you should be disabling and what's really necessary to make the device do what you need to do. There may be things that we disable during this video that you might actually have to have because of the applications you're running, and that's okay. At least you'll understand what they are, what the threats are, and hopefully be able to change the default port configuration to minimize your threat surface. So before we get started, I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. First of all, never ever point your NAS unit to the public internet. Don't put it out at DMZ. Don't do any of that kind of configuration where your NAS device is actually exposed. The idea of a NAS unit is to keep it really tucked away, safely protecting your data and doing what you need to do internally. Just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean it's always a good idea to do it. And most importantly, to access your device when you're away from home, which many of us want to do, that's part of the inherent benefits of having a NAS is to be able to get to your files. Always use a VPN. If you stick around towards the end of this video, I'm going to show you how to configure quickly the VPN inside the QNAP unit so that you can access your device when you're away from home, either through a laptop, computer, or mobile device. So let's get started on what sections and what settings that you should really do to harden the security and exposure on your QNAP. So let's get into the control panel. I'm going to start with general settings. So on this first screen, on the system admin screen, yours should look pretty much like mine. The only thing, make sure that you do not allow QTS embedding in iframes. Make sure you've enabled HTTPS. And then also make sure that you've got the highest level of TLS enabled. And that's pretty much all you need on the screen. A lot of this is already defaulted, so we're not going to spend too much time on this. Moving on to the security section, there's a couple things that, and I've covered this on previous videos, but I'll go over it real quick anyway. If you really want to get it to the extreme, you can really take control of who and what has access to your NAS. The simplest way, or one of the simplest ways, is to actually restrict which IP addresses can get into your device. And you can do this by doing an allow connection and then selecting or typing the IP address or address range into this to limit it to, let's say, IP addresses on your particular network. Now that can be a lot of trouble, but it's one really good way to kind of lock down your NAS unit. Let's talk about the IP protection and account access protection tabs. They're in essence very similar. The only difference between them is what's being filtered. So for example, in IP protection, you're looking at IP addresses that have too many failed attempts, whether it's whatever the IP address is. In account protection, you're looking at protocols. So if anybody's trying to come in through Telnet, for example, and they have a lot of failed attempts, then it's going to lock them out. So these are in essence the same, but they're just different categories. So again, I would make sure that these are both on. So you shouldn't have anybody trying to bang into your server too often anyway. So I would really turn all this on and limit it. You can change the lockout period. So the default is 5 minutes, which is kind of short in my opinion, but it works. At least it gives you a flag that somebody's attempted more than 5 times. But I think, given the circumstances, I would probably lock it out for longer than that. which means if somebody legitimately gets locked out, you're going to have to go and clear them. But the last thing on this particular page I want to cover is, in essence, make your password strength as much as possible. The more difficult the password requirements, the more secure your device is. This isn't enough, but it's a place to start. Typically, I require digits and special characters. I have been conservative on my minimum length for other reasons. Sometimes I'll set up something temporarily and I don't want to mess with it too much because I'm going to take it down in an hour. However, none of my actual user passwords are anywhere near that short. They're typically 9 and above or 10 and above. If depending on who has access to your device, I would suggest you probably kick that up a little bit. If not, at least do a more complex password. The next place we want to go to is under Network File Services. We're going to go to Windows, Mac, and FS. And here we want to do a couple of things. So first of all, there are 3 basic file types or file services that you can bind to. And basically you can choose whether, if you're in a network environment or if you're in a home environment that's predominantly Windows, then of course you're going to want to use Windows networking. If you have a mixture of Windows and Macs, you can also enable the AFP or the Apple File Protocol and NFS, which is more of a Linux thing. I don't typically use these two, so mine's just set up for Microsoft networking. Under advanced options here, though, you would probably want to take a look at a couple of things here. Mostly these settings in here. Now, you can get into some trouble depending if you set these high SMB versions for file access or folder access. There are possibly some older devices on your network that may have trouble with it, but I would start by setting these up to as tight as possible. Now, what I've done here, or what we're going to do here, is the highest is 3, so I can go ahead and enable 3. And my lowest, I want to put at 2.1. So I don't want anything lower than that. And if there's something that goes wrong, then I'll deal with the problem. I'm going to go ahead and hit apply. And as we see here, it's actually changed the settings. It takes a minute or so to actually make the changes, so be patient when you actually click apply. So next we're going to go over to Telnet SSH. My recommendation here is that these all be disabled unless you have a particular need. And there's always exceptions to these rules that I'm telling you. These are baseline configurations. They're what I do to my devices. They're not necessarily going to work in 100% of the cases because you may need access. You may have to have something that tells you that you have to have such and such enabled. Right now, I'm going basically on what I consider to be a secure configuration, kind of out of the box. It's worked in every situation I've used it in, but everybody's a little different. So I've disabled everything on this page. Next, we're going to go to SNMP. Again, I've got that disabled. And the next one I want to go to is FTP. That's another one that I absolutely disable. So there's no need for me to do an FTP to my box. Now, if again, your configuration may vary, you may have to for a specific task, but I do not use FTP, so I've disabled the service. Any service you disable just lowers your footprint for security breaches and issues that you might have. Okay, so moving over to applications, there's a couple here that we want to probably definitely turn off. The first one we're going to talk about is actually the DLNA server. Now, the DLNA server was the one that was recently attacked, but that, again, that's patched, I believe, by now, so it's not as much of a concern. But again, unless you're using DLNA in your network, and I'm certainly not, I would just disable it because it is a broadcast protocol, so it's out there talking to your network. So if you don't need it, turn it off. If you find that you need it, then you go ahead and obviously you're going to use it. One of the things that may come up is multimedia services. There are several services that actually require the DLNA be enabled, in which case, you go ahead and enable that. Again, I would encourage you to first find out if you need it. Turn it off and let's see if any of your applications are forcing the requirement of a DLNA server. I've never had an issue and I don't use it. So, but again, this is my configuration. This is the big one, the web server. I know for a fact there's a couple apps that use this. I don't use those applications, and I really refuse to turn on the web server. The web server was also the second application that was actually had some significant vulnerabilities recently. And again, I believe they were patched. Unless you have a particular need, there's not usually a lot of desire to enable a web server unless it's mandated by a specific application, and then you'll have to decide how important that application is. But again, if you do use this, change the default ports. Don't use port 80, don't use 8081. Go ahead and change it to something else so that you can take at least control of it. So any generic broadcast scans can't, or won't find your particular device. But again, the web server is a little bit misleading because it's a web server backend. It doesn't necessarily mean that you want to put this in directly facing the internet. There's not enough protection for that. Don't go putting it on a DMZ zone in your router and have it, broadcast directly. That's not a good idea. The web server can be limited to internal. So if you don't allow your NAS to broadcast out by not allowing any port forwards or UPnP or any of that stuff, then at least you can restrict it to the inside. But again, I would turn it off if you don't need it. That's my recommendation. LDAP, same thing. If you don't need it, turn it off. SQL is another one. Absolutely turn it off if you don't need it. This also applies to the Radius server and the TFTP. These services are all there, but again, just because you have something and something's there doesn't mean you have to use it. You don't need it, turn them off. We want to keep these things as slim and as tight as possible and just minimize the whole entire threat surface. So let's get into something slightly more controversial, and that's the MyQNAPCloud application. Now, to keep it short and direct, my recommendation is do not use this. There's just a lot of things about this that I don't like. Obviously, the intent, the convenience factor to be able to quickly access your device when you're away from home is tempting. But I would seriously think about whether or not you really want to use this. To me, it's not the best application I've ever seen, the way it's configured. The fact that they're really pushing the auto router configuration, which is the UPnP, sure, it can be disabled, but the process of setting up is not the best I've ever seen. So it really doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. So to me, I wouldn't use it. My preference, the way I want to connect to my device when I'm away from home, is to use OpenVPN. And we'll get into that a little bit because I think that's a far more secure way of doing it. Yeah, you have to you have to come in and do one little extra step in terms of being able to connect. But at the end of the day, if you funnel everything through one, your threat surface is much better, and you don't have to go through an unknown third-party cloud application to actually connect to your home device. So again, my recommendation is just not to use this unless you absolutely have to or find no other way. Go with OpenVPN. A couple quick things before we move on to the VPN service. There is a couple applications that, for reasons I'm not quite sure about, are not installed by default that you really should put on, and that's the malware remover and the security counselor. Now, these aren't mandatory, but the malware remover application actually scans your system much like antivirus, and it looks for any threats, at least threats that they have released through their application. The security counselor kind of does also a similar thing, except it doesn't scan for threats. It actually looks into your system configuration for things that you might have configured wrong or maybe need to disable. So it's a quick way to just scan your system and see if everything is configured correctly. So I would really recommend installing both of these applications. Both can be set up to run automatically just to make sure nothing's changed, or to, in the case of the malware remover, just to make sure that it's scanning your system on a regular basis. So I'm not going to get too deep into these applications. There are some videos out there that kind of dig in a little deeper. And if there's an interest, I will do a little bit more deeper dive into the Security Counselor app. But I would recommend you go ahead and load it and give it a shot. And lastly, let's get into the VPN itself, because I think there's there's probably some fear about setting one of these up and how difficult it is to use. So we'll get into quickly how to configure it, and then I'm going to show you how to set it up on a mobile app. So I'm going to go into the QVPN server. Now, there's a lot of protocols you can use in here. My go-to is OpenVPN. So what I typically do is I usually don't enable most of these, and I'll go down to OpenVPN. I'll enable that. I'm ready to go. Now, there's there's not much to really configuring this. There's only a couple things you need to decide. Number one, your IP range. If this is the default IP range, it works 99% of the time. If you have an IP conflict because of another device on your network, then you may have to change this to 10.9 or 10.10 or some other IP range that's not going to conflict with anything you have on your network. Again, most of the time it's not an issue, but there may be times where you might have a couple devices that have VPN enabled, and that may cause some conflicts. The rest of this, the encryption is always set to high. You can limit the number of maximum clients. You can also select the network interface. Now, in my case, I have several interfaces on this particular device, and only one of them is actually connected to a LAN that connects to the internet in any way, shape, or form, or connects to my router. So I've specified that adapter. Most of the time, it's not necessary. You'll probably only have one attached to it. And then you want to use this connection as the default gateway, meaning when a VPN connection comes in, it's going to attach not only to the VPN, but the traffic will also route through the VPN. So everything's going to be coming out of your home as opposed to, Starbucks or wherever. Now you can optionally enable compressed VPN link. That comes in handy when you have possibly a slow connection on one side. You can experiment with that. You can try disabling it or enabling it, see which one gives you the best performance for where you happen to be located. And in terms of configuration, that's really all there is to do. There's a couple boxes here, download configuration file. So if I click download configuration file, it is going to download a file, which you can see here. It is a OPVPN file that I'm going to import into one of many different devices, whether it's a PC or whether it's an iOS device or Android or whatever. That's the OpenVPN file that I'm going to use. Now, there's one last thing I need to configure here, and that's the privilege settings. So if you have, depending on the number of users you can add VPN users based on your NAS configuration. So if you've got users on your NAS, you can add them to the VPN. That'll be totally up to your own particular configuration. In my case, I only have 2 users, and because the VPN in terms of getting access outside is really limited to me. So I basically restrict who has access to the VPN, and you can also decide which protocols that they have access to. So that's all you really need. It's nothing very complicated. Once you've done this, that's all you need to do on the server side, except for going into your router and doing a port forward. And that port forward is done to port 1194. I can't tell you how to do a port forward in your own router. You're going to have to look that up. But basically, you're going to do a port forward to the IP address of your NAS. And the port that you're forwarding is 1194. So when OpenVPN connects, it will know your IP address, connect to it, port forward to the NAS unit, and it becomes the connected device. And that's extremely secure. OpenVPN has been vetted several times, and it's actually a pretty secure protocol. So it's definitely much better than any intermediary cloud service that you might use. That's about it for the actual network configuration or NAS configuration. We're going to get into the client real quick, just to some bonus features, just to show you how we've taken this VPN configuration and basically set it up on a client device so you can see how it works. And then from there, you should be able to easily create a VPN service. So let's get into how to set up OpenVPN. I'm going to show you 2 different configurations. One way is to actually do it on your laptop or PC, and the other way is to actually do it on a mobile app. Let's start with the PC. I'll include a link to download the OpenVPN client, but once you download it, it's pretty simple, and install it. It's pretty simple. What you're going to do is go down here to the icon that says OpenVPN, and on a fresh install, you're not going to have any profiles. So I'm going to right click on it and click Import Profile, and I'm going to go over to where I downloaded my default downloads or wherever I've copied the file to. I'm going to click on the OpenVPN file that we downloaded, and it says Import Successful, and that's pretty much all I got to do. Now when I go to the icon at the bottom, I can actually connect to it. So it's actually loaded the configuration file. I click connect, type in my username and password. Now just be advised that this only works on accounts that you've enabled. And if you refer back to the early part of the video where you've allowed a specific user to have VPN access, so that you have to reuse those same credentials when you're connecting. When you transmit the file, and I'll show you this on the mobile app, you can email this file to yourself. It's obviously a little less secure, but the file itself doesn't contain any user credentials. So your username and password are not included in the file. Those stay and reside in the server. Let's take a quick look on how to set up the OpenVPN via an email that you've sent to yourself. Again, this is probably less secure, and if you can copy it directly to your device, I would recommend doing that. On iOS, it's a little bit more difficult. You got to go through a few extra gyrations to get that to happen. So this is an alternative method of actually installing the profile. Again, the profile doesn't contain any username and password, so we can probably survive with a little bit less secure transfer. So once it's in your email, simply tap on it, hit share, set it to OpenVPN, and we're going to click the add profile. It's giving me a couple of profiles because I've added this same profile a couple different times. So we're going to go ahead and pick the one that we just put in. We'll click add, and we'll put the username. And again, I'm putting in the admin, but don't do that. Use the username that you've defined in your NAS. And then up here in the right-hand corner, you're just going to click on add, and you're connected. So now if I go back to the upper right-hand corner, you can see that I have a VPN symbol in the top right side, which tells me that I'm connected to the VPN. And again, you only have to do the import once. You don't have to do this every time. And if you memorize your password with your profile, then all you have to really do is slide the slider in your iOS or Android device, and you'll be instantly connected. So the pain threshold for actually connecting to your VPN is pretty low. So again, this is a much more secure way of connecting to your device. This gives me access to everything on my network that particular user has, and then you can go from there. If anybody's interested, I could do a more thorough, detailed, deep dive into OpenVPN. Just post your requirements in the comments, and if enough people are interested, I'll be glad to do that. So anyway, I think that's about it for today's video. I appreciate you sticking around to the end, and if you haven't already done so, please subscribe and click that notification so you'll be notified of any new content. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next video.